So hi, my name is Mitu, and I'm also someone who once tried to get rid of ants at a picnic by first summoning a T-Rex and then trying to give it a shotgun and then having the whole thing just swept away by a hastily conjured up black hole. In addition to that, I'm also faculty here at the Game Center, and I have the pleasure of introducing to you our final guest speaker of practice. So Liz England is a systems designer and a 10-year veteran of the games industry. She was hired by Fifth Cell as the first full-time person to work on Scribblenauts, which was released in 2009. And Scribblenauts, of course, was this incredible puzzle game about using words to conjure objects and solve those puzzles in that way. She went on to continue working on 2 more Scribblenauts titles, and then she went to work in AAA, shipping titles such as Resistance 3 and Sunset Overdrive. So she's now at Ubisoft Toronto, where she's acting as a lead designer on a currently unannounced project. You may also know her, and one of the things I really like about Liz and her presence online, because of her thoughtful advocacy around games and I feel that she acts as a really useful resource for people wanting to know how to get into the industry, and she's really valuable in helping students understand some of that process. On that note, she's also infamous for coming up with the door problem, which you might be familiar with, which is this wonderful way of describing the role of what a game designer does, and also is extendable to understanding what some of the other roles in the games industry is as well. So if you're not familiar with that, definitely Google it, the door problem. So what I love about Liz's work specifically, and her sort of design sensibilities, is her focus and her deep understanding of complex interdependent systems. How to construct them, how to deconstruct them, and the way that for the player, these systems actually give rise to these emergent stories, which I feel have these kind of varying levels of implicit versus explicit storytelling. So in Scribblenauts, for example, which she'll be talking about today, these stories are often explicit, right? They give us stories that we can tell each other about what happened and how we solved various puzzles. It makes us feel smart for coming up with solutions which make us wonder whether anyone else has actually thought of the same way of solving that particular puzzle. And I think part of the game of Scribblenauts, to me, feels like trying to stumble upon things the designers perhaps hadn't thought of, right? That's part of the fun of it. And I think that kind of design is something which often for many developers is kind of a source of anxiety, right? Is the player going to do something that I hadn't thought of? So I look forward to hearing her talk more about her process there. So as I said, she is our last guest speaker of practice, so please give a warm round of applause for Liz England.
Just kidding. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for everyone who has stuck around to the very end of practice to listen to me talk about this little game. So about 10 years ago, as Mitu mentioned, I got my very first job as a game designer on a game called Scribblenauts. It was my first job, the first time that I was working in games professionally. Since then, I've shipped several games. And whenever we talk about the kinds of games that we've worked on and interesting design problems, I always mention Scribblenauts, and it's always that one that other designers will react really excitedly, or sometimes with that anxious sort of haunted look. It's like, how did you do it? That game should be impossible. And I kind of want to talk about that word first because I do hear it a lot. It's kind of weird to me because from my point of view, Scribblenauts is actually a very straightforward game. I'm like, well, you want to know how I did it? Here's a list. The fact that Scribblenauts even exists means that it's not an impossible game to make. So the game has a deceptively simple premise. Write the name of any object and it will appear in game and you can use it. So when someone calls this impossible, they read the mission statement, the creative statement of the game, they say that it's impossible, I think what they really mean is fulfilling the promise of this statement of the game to a level that meets a player's expectations is impossible. The possibility space that's implied by this statement is just absolutely huge. It's potentially infinite. And there's just so many outstanding questions that it can be overwhelming to even tackle this concept. So imagine, sorry, I'm going to use a box metaphor. Imagine that a game is a box, and everything inside the box is what you put in the game, and outside of the game is the stuff, or outside of the box is stuff outside of the game. So an impossible game in this context is a box of undetermined size. You don't actually know what goes into the game. You don't know what you leave out. So I feel like a lot of times the role of a game designer is often determining actually the size and shape and dimensions of that box. And that's sort of determining the possibility space of your game. So this was my role on Scribblenauts. So Scribblenauts doesn't do everything. There are limits. So today I'm going to kind of walk you through the steps and processes I took to help define, as part of a team, but help define that possibility space and make sense of the game from that creative statement that is so broad and vague. It reflects my personal practice, because one of the things I love doing is taking that broad creative statement and then attacking it in a methodical, I just drank a lot of coffee, a methodical fashion, breaking it down into all its component parts, right? Like trying to make sense of that thing. So with that, we're going to talk about Scribblenauts. So most people know what Scribblenauts is, but it's a 2D puzzle platformer that released on Nintendo DS. I'm going to talk mainly about the first game. And you use your stylus to write the name of any object in the known universe, and those objects will then spawn into the game, and you have a little avatar Maxwell there, and he could use those objects to accomplish your goal. So the initial pitch document actually has an example of a star and a tree, and you have to help Maxwell get to it by spawning things like a ladder or an axe. This ended up being actually the first level of the first game. So the first step for making a game like Scribblenauts is making a list of every object in the known universe. That's all you have to do. It's simple. So when I started, if I remember correctly, I was the first person full-time on the project, first project I ever worked on, and all I had was an Excel sheet and the internet. And this was the time in which I just started the list of words. And in developer interviews, someone once said that we scour dictionaries for words, because that's where you find words, they're in dictionaries. And people have been repeating it forever. So I just want you to know that that's a lie. Not a complete lie, but mostly a lie. Dictionaries are a great place to get words if you don't care anything about the words that you're trying to collect. At the start of the project, the main goal was to find words with certain qualities to them. And those qualities, besides being objects, were we wanted words that were familiar to people, so things that people would recognize and already part of their vocabulary. We wanted to focus on generic common vocabulary before we got to uncommon vocabulary. We wanted to include the word bird before I start looking at chickens or cassowaries or ostriches. Like, bird is more important for us. And different objects were much, much more important than similar objects. So part of mapping that possibility space, that box metaphor that I went on too long about, is trying to find the most different objects from each other to try to find the dimensions of that possibility space. I wanted as broad a spectrum as possible. So dictionaries are not great for this, because it just has a list of words. There's no prioritization with dictionaries. So there's actually a really great resource, and it's like kids' encyclopedias are amazing. So to be serious, like, children's learning materials are all about common vocabulary, things that are familiar to people, and kind of a survey, often a visual content, that like animals or food or vehicles. And then another awesome resource is like foreign language teaching aids, because again, there's a huge range. There's also a range in specificity. And the goal of these kinds of teaching aids is to give language learners at least one common word to use to describe any given type of object. So I know the difference between boots and sandals in Spanish. And that's so that they can communicate. And so it focused on like sort of a survey of objects of a category that were different enough to need unique language to describe them. So this kind of helps a lot for just mapping the edges of that possibility space. What are the kinds of things, what are the most archetypical things that exist in the known universe? And over time, as I'm collecting these lists of words, I'm getting more and more specific. So start as most broad categories as possible, like tree or car or monster. And then at some point, you need to do deep dives. So an example of a deep dive might be filling in the blanks by taking a common generic term like tree and asking, well, what kind of trees exist, right? So now all trees might share like 99% of the same properties. I can't tell the difference between most trees, But the trees that we care about for a game like Scribblenauts were the trees that were most visually distinct or had some property or behavior that set it different from other objects, right? So like an apple tree will have apples on it. That makes it a very distinct kind of tree. So you might wonder, like, how do you find every tree in the known universe? So there's another really great resource that I'm going to introduce you to, and it's called Wikipedia. In just 3 steps. So the first thing that you do is you look up any object in Wikipedia, like a pastry blender. Thankfully, it comes with a visual reference as well, in case you need to make an 8x8 pixel art piece out of it. Then you scroll down to the bottom of the page, and there's this thing called categories. Like every page is inside categories. And when you click that, so like, for example, pastry blenders are in the category cooking utensils. And then when you click that button, you get a list of all the pages in that category. And it turns out that pages in the category cooking utensils are all cooking utensils. So it's so exciting. So it gets things like a mandolin or a melon ball or a microplane, and like each object actually has a link to a page, so I get a visual reference and I get any kind of synonyms that we might also want to call that object. And this is why when people ask me about, oh, what was it like working on Scribblenauts, I was like, I spent 3 years reading Wikipedia for a living. I'm still bad at trivia though. So you get lists of every object in the known universe, thanks to Wikipedia. And then the next step is, really simple too, right? Like, you're building a list of objects. You're also simultaneously trying to categorize them, like group them into clusters. And for Scribblenauts, we went with a hierarchical system. So every object belonged in one spot in the hierarchy and could inherit properties from above it. So I'll give you an example. So here's 4 examples of categories of like 30 top-level categories: fish, mammal, bird, reptile. And if you go through mammal and you're just like, okay, let me see what the subcategories there are, you might get air, land, and water mammals. And then after that, you might look at land mammals and then get to categories like rodents or bears or felines. And then we'll go down feline and see, now we have individual objects. So we put them in a hierarchy and said of felines we have cat, tiger, lion, jaguar, lynx, and then probably at least 40 more of just like main objects, excluding synonyms, which I'll go into later. And I could say that all land mammals can walk, and all felines have some things in common, like they chase mice and string, and they drink milk, and then each individual object could have its own set of properties that after it inherits stuff to set them apart. So there's a key problem here, which is like, okay, so where does a merlion fit? Because this is a game that has every object in the known universe, so I have to include merlion. Is it a lion or is it a fish? Or is it actually part of the monster category? Questions like, is lettuce a plant or is it a food? Is a swordfish a fish or a sword? It's both. Is a hot dog a sandwich or a taco? Sorry. We had this problem everywhere because we could only, there was an early decision on a technical side to just place an object in one spot in the hierarchy. And categorization is a really complex problem space, and I, as a 23-year-old game designer who was completely unfamiliar with the topic, was not going to solve it. So this was our best case scenario. The only real lesson I have here, after now 10 years later, is probably use tags instead. But that aside, the other problem I ran into with Scribblenauts is that originally we wanted to inherit as much of those properties as possible, right? So both lions and jaguars and cats would chase string. But what happened instead as we're building out this dictionary is the realization that differences are far, far more important than the similarities between these objects. So that meant that the differences between any 2 objects, like a cat and a lion, is more important than the fact that they share something in common. So we had to go through individually and add all the exceptions or the individual features of any given object to set it aside from other objects. So for example, with lions, because they're felines, they might play with string. But if you have a lion tamer, the lion should ignore the string and go for the lion tamer because it's a more specific interaction that's more expected. And it's about prioritization as well. So we categorize objects. So we have a list of every object in the known universe. That was easy. We categorize every object in the known universe. That's great. So then we just have to, figure out what kind of systems you need to actually make them like function in some form of way in a video game. So this is where, so this sort of work is happening in tandem. As we're coming up with objects and we're filling out our lists of objects and we're filling out our categories, we're starting to recognize that there's similar systems across multiple objects. So I'm going to give you I'm going to illustrate with this a simple example. So let's say that we have a bird, and one of the biggest properties of birds is that they can fly, right? So, okay, fly is a property that I need objects to have. So we have birds that they can fly. Okay, now let me look at my list in my dictionary and see what kinds of other birds that exist that deviate from this rule. And then we get an ostrich, right? And we know that ostriches are birds, but that they can't fly, so we make a new type of movement that is walk. And then we retroactively look back at the bird and we say, actually, birds can walk too. We just weren't thinking that birds could walk because mainly they fly. So now we have like two different ways to describe movement for animals, and so we start looking at the other birds that exist. So then we get to like ducks, right? So ducks can fly and they can walk. But there's another special thing that ducks can do. They can swim. So we have to add swim as a new verb, and now we've got like, okay, we have movement is a little bit more complex. And so then we start looking at all the objects in the known universe and say, okay, what else can swim? And we get fish. We know fish can swim, but then you start looking at ducks and fish, and you're like, oh, they swim really differently because ducks can actually drown. These sort of things are important. So then we create another movement type called swim underwater. So over the course of just 4 objects, I've actually uncovered all of the movement types in the entire game. So there's some difference, there's some like immovable objects and like exceptions to the rule, but like this is actually all of the movement that existed in the first Scribblenauts game, and you just find it from 4 objects. And then when I take these and I start looking at other objects that maybe are not animals, but have something to do with movement, I start getting things like the object wings or the object scuba gear. And I realize, okay, wings allow things that have equipped it to fly. We already have fly. It's already a property kind of like, I don't want to say a solved case, because then programmer has to make it work, but we have a system that already acknowledges that this is another type of movement. So from the 4 objects I spec'd out, we already have 4 different type of movement types. And this happens consistently. We repeat this process with other properties. When we get to something like fire, we're like, oh, I think we need to model temperature. So when we look at that, we start getting a whole bunch of different things regarding temperature, right? Because some things melt, and some things turn to gas, and some things can be cooked, and some things can be frozen. And you have objects like ovens and refrigerators and ice and icebergs and lava. And altogether, I could just look at like a handful of objects and get the range of stuff that you need in order to actually simulate the rest of them for about 90% of the cases. So we went through this consistently with a whole bunch of different systems. These are just the systems that I could remember offhand, because it's been about 8 years since I've worked on any of the games. But things like things can float or they'll sink in water. Things like health and attack is actually oddly important, because you're not just like, okay, combat designers are saying, okay, what does more damage than what? But I'm saying, of all the known objects in the universe, how much damage does a rabbit do compared to a spatula, compared to a unicorn, compared to a kraken? Like, what is that range, and where does the spatula fall in there, right? So it's a little bit, some of the things that we had to deal with were a little bit crazy on that end. As we're solving cases for things that make a specific object kind of unique, we're creating a system that then applies for all the objects. And that's not to say we didn't have edge cases. So we had a bunch of edge cases that, like a black hole, for example, it works in a very specific way. There's not really any other objects that work like a black hole. They were just put in a pile of objects that we considered special case, and then programmers would take them over and actually implement them. Like time machines, time travel doesn't need to be a system in the game. There's only like 1 or 2 objects that allow for time travel in the game. So we just special case those objects instead of creating a whole system for it. So we added more objects and systems into the game, and questions started to rise, as you would expect, regarding the overlap of these systems, right? So we're creating temperature, and then we're also creating the concept of containers where objects can go into other objects, which was kind of mind-blowing at the time. And then at some point, you have to look at these when they overlap, and how do they overlap. So a good example of this that came up a lot in meetings was, for example, we know that lions eat babies. This was uncontroversial for us. Lions eat babies. So then we implemented the concept of attachments, so like glue. So if you glued a baby to a bomb, would the lion eat the baby and then swallow the bomb and then explode? I'm like, yeah, in cartoon logic, totally, yes, it should. So we made that happen. But then it came with a question. I mean, of course, right? And then there was a question of, okay, so if an animal consumes an item, it also consumes everything it's attached to, right? So then what if you glued a baby to a tank? Does the lion just eat the whole tank? How does that work? So we made a rule that you can only eat items if they're your size or smaller. But then we came up with another case, which is, what if you glue a lion to a baby, right? If the lion eats the baby and everything is glued to, does it eat itself? The answer was temporarily yes, and then we fixed the use case. But we had a lot of cases, so many cases that were like this. This is always my favorite anecdote. But there were so many just sit in a meeting with really smart people trying to decide what happens when you glue a baby and a lion together. When we shipped Scribblenauts, there were obviously exploits in the game, and we expected this. There's some element of the emergent behavior allow it to happen. And my favorite one is what I call the handcuffs and vending machine exploit. So I'll go over it really quickly. In the levels in the first Scribblenauts game, most of your goal was to go and collect a star from somewhere in the level, and it was kind of a puzzle platformer using traversal mechanics and traversal objects to get there and to get through different kind of obstacles. So the vending machine and handcuffs, the way it worked is you spawn a pair of handcuffs, and because you spawned it, you could move it around the screen wherever you wanted. And then you attach one end of the handcuffs to the star. Great. Then you spawn a vending machine, and you put the vending machine next to the handcuffs. Now, vending machines are special because they're a container that is the largest size container that exists in the game, but they're also the smallest object of that size, so they fit in more places. So you put the vending machine as close as you can get to the handcuffs, and you drag the other end of the handcuffs to the vending machine, and you get an option. Do you attach the handcuffs, or do you put them inside the vending machine? So you put them inside the vending machine, so the handcuffs go inside the vending machine, and the star goes inside the vending machine with it. And then you drag the vending machine over next to you, go up, use it, and out pops your star, and you're done. So I think half of the levels could be solved with just these two items, which is in some ways unfortunate, but I love it. I have no problem with this exploit existing in the game. So by the time we shipped, this is my memory, so we had about 8,000 to 10,000 unique objects, but 20,000 words, and that's because we relied really heavily on synonyms for less common terms that could be grouped together, and there's no functional or visual difference between those two words. For example, a bear and a brown bear actually spawn the same object. I know that's gonna break your mind, but there's no difference between those. One's just a synonym for the other. We only set up properties and information for one of those. So we relied on synonyms quite a bit. When you have 20,000 words, you might be tempted to think that, oh wow, the player has tons of expressive power in the game. And practically speaking, from a player experience point of view, this is an infinite amount of choice that you have. But I'd watch people play the game, and there was a problem. So when players are prompted to write anything, they don't believe you. Players are stumped. Their mind goes blank. They're like, it's not really anything. So can you tell me what it really is? Tell me what I'm supposed to write. What am I supposed to do? So most of the time in a case like this, when you prompt the player to get a star out of the tree, a lot of them will do ladder. It was in our marketing materials. It was a familiar word. So they would write ladder, you climb the ladder, go get the star. Great. That meant that the players would learn items like this, like ladder, and they would keep them in their personal mental dictionary and reuse them over time. They kind of optimize their play. They know how ladders work, they're familiar with them, they know how to spell them, they just use them in any case where they need to climb something. And they kind of came a crutch. So you have 20,000 words and a player might use 10 of them, their personal vocabulary, for most of the puzzles in the game because of the unique properties of those items. But for example, in this case, you could have a trampoline, you could ride a rocket ship, you could ride a pterodactyl, you could spawn a kleptomaniac and then give it wings. It will fly over to the star, pick it up, and then you could shoot it with a tranquilizer dart so that it would fall down, then you could take the star from it. You could just glue put glue on the star and then put a fork next to it and then use a magnet and it would fly out of the tree. So the players just use the ladder. So there's something to be said about players optimizing a solution and us wanting to encourage players because the most fun you had in the game is the least optimal solution. But encouraging players to have that kind of fun was actually kind of hard. So that's Scribblenauts, but I do want to talk a little bit about Super Scribblenauts, which is the sequel. And I worked on that as well. So there were a lot of similar design challenges, but in Super Scribblenauts, in the first game, you could spawn any object in the known universe. In Super Scribblenauts, you could also add adjectives. That's pretty simple. Only 1/6 of the English language are adjectives. So you could have, for example, a happy, tired, blue, headless zombie rabbit, and that would be a valid thing that you could spawn in the game, and it would look and act mostly the way you would expect. And that was the promise of a sequel. And so the first thing I did when they told me we're going to add adjectives, actually the second thing, the first thing I did was I threatened to quit, but the second thing I did was I did some math. Right? So let's say we had, because we knew we were going to expand the dictionary a little bit, with 10,000 unique objects that have unique properties or art associated with it, 5,000 unique adjectives. Now there's fewer adjectives that are unique despite the fact that the vocabulary is much higher because we rely a lot on synonyms. I'll get into that in a bit. And then we could have up to 5 adjectives on any given object. So you can stack 5 adjectives onto 10,000 unique objects. So you just do some math and I won't give you the full number, but I'll say that if you test 100 objects per second, just to see if they crash, there's always unique things, so 100 objects per second, it would only take 9.8 trillion years to test every possible combination. But that's okay, we don't have that much time to actually test the game. So there's another way of doing it, which is it would only take 9.8 trillion computers 1 year to test the game. So we made the game knowing that there were going to be bugs. I was actually largely surprised myself. Maybe it's pessimism, maybe it's just I did the math and I knew what this number meant. But Super Scribblenauts was a lot less buggy than the first game. So the first game did release with some crashes in the game, some bugs, some things that we wanted to fix. When we got to the second game, it was actually much cleaner. It was a much smoother experience for the player in general, despite this ridiculous number. So the question comes up then, how do I get a list of every adjective that exists in the known universe in English? And it's kind of the same as before. It's foreign language learning materials is great for finding adjectives that are unique and different kinds of adjectives to describe things like color or sleepy and happy and heroic and curly. And so I could do that as a quick pass, but it was hard to find a good number of these, unlike objects where I had Wikipedia to go to. So, in Scribblenauts, I had another trick, right? So in Scribblenauts, I used Wikipedia for a lot of the deep dive stuff. But here we have a totally different trick. The first step is to get a dictionary. I went to Project Gutenberg and just found a public domain dictionary. Then I copied the entire contents of the dictionary to Excel. And then I stripped out everything that wasn't an adjective. And so then I had a list of about 80,000 adjectives, which is, a sizable book of just a list of words. So it also included a bunch of things that weren't very useful to us, right? 35 bears is not 35 is an adjective, but it's not one we're going to simulate. And distant bear, I'm I don't know, is it emotionally distant or is it visually distant? I don't know about that. And we weren't going to simulate some of these words, but we collected some of them anyway, just so that we can evaluate them. And I would basically spend a lot of time, a lot of different days, just part of my work, just reading through the list, and every time that word, but we weren't going to try and do all 80,000. We knew there's just too many words for us to try to include every adjective. So again, we try to get the most common adjectives that we personally recognize. It was a very subjective process to do that. And then the other technique I used was thesaurus software. So most notably, Google's dictionary feature will also reveal a ton of adjectives. So for example, happy has synonyms like cheerful, cheery, merry, joyful, jovial, jolly, jocular, gleeful, carefree, untroubled. Anyway, all of these existed in the game. And again, adjectives relied really heavily on synonyms, and so For example, I remember sad actually had the most synonyms of any other adjective, which is also quite sad. But there's no real functional difference in a game like Scribblenauts between words like sad and solemn and downtrodden. There's nuances in these when we use them in our language, but the nuances don't really translate to our game, so we can just lump them up together as synonyms and just say they're all equivalently sad. Sorry. The next thing to keep in mind is that when we're starting to look at the systems is that adjectives are modifiers. They don't exist on their own. They always exist in tandem with an object. And we had already defined tons of properties about objects, so we relied on existing systems to cover a bulk of adjective implementation. For example, we had existing systems like movement and material and temperature and electricity, and adjectives would just swap like a checkbox or a property here and there all over the place. So like flying or flying spatula would just change the ability, the movement of spatula objects to include flying. It was surprising actually how much reuse we got out of the original dictionary properties just when we added adjectives. Adjectives also implied new systems, so stuff like color or size or texture or audio. These are largely about visual representations, since in Scribblenauts we only had one piece of unchangeable art for each object, but adjectives can now modify the art. Additionally, we had stuff like AI, so what does a sentient spatula do? How does it move? What does it eat? Because now any object in the game can be sentient. So with sentient itself as an adjective, we had to define what exactly that means. I mentioned some nuance with adjectives regarding sad, but there's some nuance that we did capture that I'm going to give you from an example, which is like the AI state sick. Like, what does it mean to be sick? So here's some examples. So like a sick spatula, that's pretty simple. The spatula is sick. You can see that in your head. A nauseating spatula will make anyone who sees it sick. An infectious spatula will make anyone who touches the spatula sick. A venomous spatula, if you pick it up and you attack someone with it, they get sick. Alternatively, if the spatula is sentient and angry at you and attacks you, it also makes you sick. And then a rancid spatula will make anyone who eats it sick. So normally nothing eats a spatula unless you spawn someone that's hungry. But if you made a bacony spatula and then you spawned a carnivore, like it's gonna go eat the spatula. And if it's also rancid, it'll get sick. So that's kind of like how the adjectives kind of worked in tandem with the objects. And just like there was in Scribblenauts, the exploit of the handcuffs and the vending machine, in Super Scribblenauts, the exploit was the dead lion meta. So a lot of the puzzles in Super Scribblenauts were about contextual, like solve someone's problem with an object or a creative thing, add a topping to a pizza, solve this person's problem. And for some reason, Dead Lion actually covers a bunch of different checkboxes in a bunch of very weird ways. Like it's an animal and it's also a predator, it's scary, it's dead. We had a lot of puzzles regarding dead things. And it wouldn't attack you because it was dead, so that was also useful. So there's an awesome speed run that uses a lot of dead lions. So I'm just going to ask someone to tell me when I'm getting to about 10 minutes to the end. So one of the important things about Scribblenauts, and it's like a major lesson I kind of learned that I've taken to a lot of other projects, is that Scribblenauts isn't really a simulation game, it's a cartoon. It's got a different level of expectation from players. Like, players expect certain things out of simulations, and they expect different things out of cartoons. And there's different tactics to take when trying to develop, like, the systems logic of the game to align with player expectation. So the first I want to go over is cartoon logic, not real-world logic. So that in the world of Scribblenauts, elephants flee from mice, cops eat donuts, and if a mongoose and a cobra fight, the mongoose must win. I got a lot of bugs about that. This is just sort of like, these are the truths of the world as according to a cartoon. So you expect them to work. You expect all cats to drink milk. The next part is that, related to that, is like, what we care about what people believe is true, not what is actually true. It's not about factual accuracy. So if you try to feed milk to a cat in real life, you shouldn't do it because it makes cats sick. But in our game, it was okay. So Wikipedia, which is a crowdsourced site, is great for common knowledge regardless of the misconceptions. Sorry. The next lesson is that we kind of focused on symbolic representation quite a bit. So especially since we had small objects, and often the objects were like 32 to 48 pixels tall on average, we needed them to be immediately recognizable. So when a player writes a word, they often write the most generic form. So they might write bear, and not black bear, grizzly bear, polar bear, panda bear, teddy bear, and so on and so forth. They'll write bear. And so the more generalized the word, the more we try to lean on like the commonly accepted default visualization of that object. But there is a side effect to it. So tell me in this example, which one's the doctor and which one's the nurse? What comes to mind if I say butler or maid? What does a cop look like? Because there's only one cop in our game, so it has to represent all of them. What does a criminal look like? And I know this is a kid's game, but we also have every object in the known universe, so long as it's not vulgar. So what does a slave look like? What does a terrorist look like? So you start going down this sort of path that's like, what actually are we showing? Because you can look at any individual object, and maybe that one is like, oh yeah, that's fine. But then you look at like hundreds of objects together, like how are you actually representing people in a game? And we had one single piece of art to represent them. So do we represent the commonly accepted default that's easily recognizable at the risk of reinforcing stereotypes? Do we deviate? How much? How often? On which objects? I personally did a lot of what I would call like diversity passes, right? Just like look at, here's all the women in the game, here's all the men in the game. Oh, there's 5 times as many male characters as there are female characters. Why? And like, which ones do we swap around? And to be honest, like, I was very new to games at the time. With what I know now, I think we should have been a lot more aggressive on that, although people haven't really called us out quite about it. But if I could go back and redo stuff, there's still more objects that I think I would have fixed or changed the way they represented, especially people. So after this, I want to talk about my unscientific hierarchy of player satisfaction, not to be confused with anything that's like actual real psychology, like it's not self-determination theory, it's none of that stuff, although I do use a hierarchy, a pyramid. It's my own rationalization or kind of understanding of what we gave the players in terms of like the level of fidelity to the promise we had, which was write any object. And the first level of that kind of fidelity was that the system recognized the player's input. So the player writes a word and something appears. So it didn't even have to be the thing that they wrote. We actually found, and this is really sad, lots of players didn't know what a noun was. And if they knew what a noun was, they didn't know what an object was. So they might write, I want love. And I'm like, love's not an object, guys. Like, I have an English degree. I get really sad. And then when we got to super Scribblenauts where we add adjectives, then it just like, a player grasp of grammar was like severely degraded. So like we had players write things like lots of really big guns. I'm like, how am I supposed to parse that? Those are not all adjectives. You got a big gun. That's all you got. We relied on a spell checking system so that no matter what the player wrote, even if it was complete gibberish, the game would recognize their input and offer them something in a, did you mean X? If it was an adjective that they didn't understand, we would just drop the adjective off of the list because you had up to 5. This went a huge way for players with poor grammar, but also to hide up the fact that we didn't actually include every single object. There were stuff that we missed here and there, and the spell check system allowed players to still spawn something even when what we were offering them wasn't what they had asked for. The next step is the game actually understanding the player's input. So the player writes a word, writes the name of an object, and that object appeared. So I wrote turnip, and a turnip appeared, and I recognized this image as a turnip, right? It's like recognizable. It's like, oh, there's almost like there's two-way communication between me and the game. The next step was a reaction. So the player writes the name of an object, the object they wrote actually appeared, and they recognized it, and then something happens. So like the game reacts in some way. So I write a monster appears, and it looks like a monster, and then it starts running around or fleeing or attacking or eating things. The system is reacting in some dynamic way. But the important thing there is the goal. The goal was always the top part, which is the player writes the name of an object. The object appears, they recognize it, and then it acts or reacts in a predictable manner that the player can understand. The player can now feel like they have some semblance of control over the game. They can predict their actions. This allows for mastery over the game systems. And my personal feeling is that we didn't get this right often enough. And I will illustrate this with an example. So, can anyone tell me what the monkey is fleeing from? Cthulhu. You're correct. You're not wrong, but in the heat of the moment, most players will say the monkey's fleeing from the banana, and that comes from three things. One, the banana is the closest thing to the monkey, so the monkey's going to react to the closest thing to it. Two, maybe it's because it's the last thing they wrote before they wrote monkey. So I'm writing a bunch of words, I wrote Cthulhu, and then I put them to the side, and then I wrote banana, and I'm like, oh, maybe I'll write monkey. I write monkey, and I just assume it's related to the previous word that I wrote. And then the third time might be just their intentions, right? They might have written Cthulhu, and then they wrote banana because they wanted to feed Cthulhu, and then Cthulhu's just ignoring it because it doesn't eat bananas. Who knew? And then you're like, oh, well, something needs to eat the banana, I'll spawn a monkey. And I want the monkey to eat the banana, so you put the monkey down and then it flees. So in your mind, you're making this association between the monkey and the banana. You've already forgotten Cthulhu. This is especially true because you have a tiny little box that you're actually playing the game off as well. So like, it's not like you have this big view of, all the things that could exist. Players had a limited ability to make sense of the simple cartoon logic. They couldn't understand cause and effect very reliably. Especially when there were more than two objects on screen. So imagine that there's 5 other objects, then you have no idea what's going on. And this is especially true during rapid actions because things like Cthulhu will go and fly over and attack things or eat things very quickly. My experiences in the heat of the game, I'd say players can't make sense of the scene at least half the time, and this is a fairly simple scene. So, at the beginning of the presentation, I described impossible in this context as being unable to fulfill the promise of the game to a level that meets players' expectations. So the experience of playing Scribblenauts is incredibly chaotic. Matu even mentioned that when she introduced me. But there's also a sense of play and of expression, of experimentation, and even joy in failure. And I feel like those sort of things kind of were like a bulwark to the fact that the game did not actually meet the promise of the creative statement quite as much as we would have liked, or at least as I would have liked. We didn't completely match expectations. There were problems. Things reacted in weird ways and you couldn't make sense of them all the time. But enough things lined up that I think people generally admit that oh, it was a weird, maybe kind of buggy and chaotic game, but it was a lot of fun. The game itself was not a failure. It succeeded in spite of the fact that it was very chaotic. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm not very good at ending presentations, but that's it. That's it.
All right, thank you so much, Liz. That was wonderful. So we're going to open the floor up to questions, so please raise your hand. Yes?
So when you were brought on, this concept was already existing, right? You were tasked with it. So, it's an impossible game. I'm curious what were the perceptions of the scale of the task? Or was there some, concept of, oh, well, this breakthrough will make this kind of game possible?
So just to repeat the question, so Liz came onto the project when it had already been conceived of, so what was the, so some things around how you perceive the scale of the task and the things involved in that?
So personally, I had a mixed response, which is, it was actually during my interview that I got to read the pitch document. They're like, we want you to work on this game. And I remember reading it and thinking, this game's never going to ship. And also, it's really interesting. I should do that. So I was just kind of naive and optimistic. And I'm like, oh yeah, sure. You tell me to make a list of every object? Okay. Just sort of like a trust that other people are going to support that. From me personally, I know from within the team, we had a really awesome technical director, and the answer I got was, as long as he says yes, we can do it. And he said yes to this. So I was like, well, okay, I guess we're going to do it. So there's a kind of a naive optimism in it. I kind of take that with a lot of my projects because I work in AAA now, for example, and I work on large teams, so I am not conceiving of the idea. I am working on someone else's idea, and I'll just follow that lead until that lead changes, and then I'll just follow the change there, right? So that's never been really much of an issue for me, at least on a creative standpoint. On a technical standpoint, they said yes, so I trusted them. Yeah.
All right. Way in the back over there.
Did you end up solving the latter problem where the things that you tried didn't work out or did work out?
Did you, so what was it? Did you try solving the ladder problem? Yeah.
Yeah, so the latter problem, obviously players are relying on their existing vocabulary and a small set of vocabulary. So for the first game, we kind of did what I would consider kind of a Band-Aid, which is we gave achievements and like alerts for like using new numbers of objects, objects from different types of objects, like, oh, you used 5 reptiles, awesome. To just give the player like some little breadcrumbs. We also had, if I remember right, it was in the first game and not the second, but it might have come in the second game. We also had a mode where you had to play through the whole game and you could never use an object more than once. So that was also kind of like an interesting way for players to challenge themselves. In Super Scribblenauts, a lot of the design of the game was actually about trying to introduce and encourage the player to use different types of objects in a thematic way. So for example, a lot of the levels are about solving someone's problems. So what I would do as like sort of like the dictionary person would be, I would compile lists of objects that haven't been used much in the game, like, oh, here's a bunch of objects related to like the Wild West, and then I give those objects like deserts and cactus and cowboy and things like that. I give them to the level designers who are creating the puzzles so that they had like brainstorm materials. So they could say things like, oh, I'm gonna make a level where you solve this cowboy's duel. And now the player is presented with a scene that uses a bunch of objects that they may not have seen before and that we haven't been using repeatedly. And then maybe we try to encourage them to use new objects that way, although players still use things like dead lions and stuff like that. But that was kind of like how we approached it with Super Scribblenauts. And I know with the later games that I didn't really work on, there was more and more of a push to encourage diverse solutions, but sometimes that meant that it was harder for players to find solutions. So there was a bit of a pro and con with that.
So was it that, so obviously implementing a solution like that would have prevented like speedruns, right? So is that something that you wanted to encourage explicitly?
We never talked about speedruns. That I remember, I was never in a conversation, I didn't even know speedrunning was a thing when I worked on these 2 games. So I don't have any concept of that. I know that me personally, as a designer, my philosophy is let the player do it. Like say yes to the player would be my philosophy. So if I could go back, I'd be like, oh yeah, totally, we want that. But
Any other questions? Yes. So you mentioned there were special classes of objects like time machine. What was baby?
Yeah, so baby was in that list. I was curious if anyone would notice that. Baby was an odd special case because of localization. So I remember I was looking through my emails to find old Scribblenauts stuff, and I remember seeing an email from our producer because we were trying to localize the game in Japan, I think it was. And we had to make sure that there was no harm to children in the game. We had to make sure children were invincible. And that included, I was like, here's a list of children objects, which was like boy, girl, altar boy, and baby. Like that was like weirdly the list of kid objects in the game. And I happened to know them offhand. And the exception though is like, you can make them invincible, but if you make an object invincible, it can still die if it's consumed, if it's eaten. Because if you eat something, you're not actually attacking it, you're just flat out consuming it. You don't have to do any kind of like fighting, like hit point thing. So I was like, yeah, it's fine, make them invincible. Oh, except for the baby, you also have to go through the Hydra and some other monsters that deliberately eat babies. They don't just like attack them, and like make some exclusions. So as a special case object, it was less about it being an edge case for programmers, but rather a list of objects in our edge case that we always had to double check against any new rules that we put in because it acted a little bit different than other objects.
Yes.
What was like working on it? What was like your fun to frustration ratio?
What was the fun to frustration ratio of working on Scribblenauts?
So like, if you, like the idea of sitting down at a desk and making a list of every object in the known universe is like tons of fun to me. So like, I definitely enjoyed my time. And I know that that is sort of like a specific, like there's a specific, maybe very small, rare subset of designers who, like the idea of that is awesome. And I am one of those. And I know that there's a bunch of designers that like, I'd be writing my resume as soon as I read like the pitch document. So like, I adored working on a game like Scribblenauts. After the first 2 games, I was kind of done. Like I had solved the problem of every object, solved the problem of every adjective, and the following game didn't really interest me too much. So I was like, let me find the next weird problem to chase. But yeah, like I loved it. There were frustrating times, and it was stuff like the bug where a mongoose and a cobra fight, and sometimes the cobra wins, was like a bug that came back constantly. And so those sort of things could be frustrating, but also kind of funny. So it helped bulwark my my enjoyment of the job.
I really love the way you sort of talk about the task of like handling such, it's like a menial task, right? Like, listing every object in the known universe, categorizing them. And like that stuff is like part of game design, right? Naturally. It just reminds me of your sort of door problem, as I mentioned, right? Like, being a designer and having to think about like every little aspect of a system. What did that experience, and that was obviously your first job in the games industry, what did that teach you in your sort of next job as you moved into AAA?
So it kind of like, so there were a lot of things that it taught me, such as use Excel to make lists of things. Like that's a huge lesson that I've used on every single project, which sounds a little silly, but like when I worked on Sunset Overdrive several years later, like I was one of the systems designers for the open world, and I had an Excel list that was a list of everything, right? Like every art asset, every quest, every gun, everything, right? And information about it. So like every time we had to make a change to a system, it's like, well, we're gonna roll out this gun at a later time because we want to reward it as part of this mission. I'd be like, okay, here are the consequences of that. And so like that's the kind of training I feel like a game like Scribblenauts worked well with, is like not only am I being familiar with the whole game and all the parts and like the detailed parts of the game, but I can also get a holistic view of it. And so like it's silly to say lists of things in the game are really important, but it actually is really important. And like using that organization skill and just being like very thorough and like detailed about it, so that when you make a change or when some change happens from somebody else, you can actually see the ripple effects across the project before those ripple effects happen.
Yeah.
Playing off of Brett's question, the fun to frustration ratio, your programmers, what was the ratio for them?
Well,
How did you like bridge that? Because I'm like, I got a little anxious.
so the question was, what was the fun to frustration ratio for the programmers?
I mean, they all seem to really enjoy it, but they're not here to say otherwise. So, I mean, everyone that I worked with really enjoyed working on it, right? Because it's a really cool, crazy game. And, I guess, the programmer who got to do the entire temperature system, like, you had to realize there was a whole heat map, like a grid heat map over the game that you can't see. So if you put fire down, it actually raises the temperature around it. And then you put more fires around, and things nearby the fire will spontaneously combust if they hit their gas point. So like there was a lot of exploration and experimentation, even when you're working on a single system. So I'm not a programmer, so I'm sure it was great. I don't know.
We'll take a couple more questions. Yes.
You were localizing, it's like most of the words and the things you were looking for in words, like something that's like common or like recognizable. Do you have to like modify those words or like think of different, different sets of things?
Not exactly. There were definitely some issues in localization, and we were a really tiny company, so it's like there was a lot of stuff that we did a little bit ad hoc. When we did localization, so our entire dictionary for I'll only talk about the first game, because I don't remember the localization process of the second game, but like every word in the game was in an Excel sheet with categories and synonyms. So like we knew we had our rows and columns, right? And then for localized language, it was a new tab in the Excel sheet. They would have the English, they'd have the English reference, and they would say, well, here are the Finnish words for this. We did have problems in which we had to clarify what exactly is this object that has a really bizarre name, but is unique enough, to put in the game. One of the problems was that sometimes localizers would have real hard trouble finding even one word to describe a unique object, but they needed to because it was an object in our dictionary, and if it was in a level and it didn't have a name, it would crash the game. So it's like everything needed at least one name, but they didn't need to do all the synonyms. That was optional, right? Like so as a monolingual English speaker, I can't evaluate whether or not we covered enough words in other languages. I also didn't really hear any complaints, but maybe I wasn't looking for them.
Yeah.
How much discussion was there around the puzzle-based structure of the game? Like, was there ever any talk like maybe it be an open world game or some broader structure?
I mean, I know that like Scribblenauts Unlimited, the third game, went a lot more open world, but I didn't really work on that. I only worked a little bit on pre-production on it. As a DS game, open world really wasn't the thing that we could do. Puzzle structure was definitely something we talked a lot about in the first game. I had my own design instinct for how the puzzle should be laid out, which should not be traversal puzzles, which I may or may not be right about because I still think traversal puzzles for a game where you can spawn any object in the universe is really like, it's not like the most creative way of using every object in the universe, but at the same time, when I read comments online, a lot of people really liked it, and I don't know how much of those are the vocal minority. It's hard for me to judge about that. I was always a big fan of doing a scene-based gameplay where things like, all right, it's little Timmy and it's his birthday party, make it awesome, add decorations. It's like, okay, now I have to think kind of like, I guess laterally, or like not trying to think of like jetpack and rope and ladder. Now I'm thinking of balloons and clown and stuff like that. We introduced actually quite a lot of that in Super Scribblenauts with the adjectives and things like that. Like, this person needs to pass their eye exam, help them. You can give them glasses or a carrot or an eye, or you can add the adjective farsighted or things like that. So we tried a lot more in the second game. Some people liked it, some people didn't. I feel like I have sometimes a lot of difficulty judging whether or not players will like a given paradigm, if that makes sense. Like these larger structural changes are hard for me to judge myself.
All right, let's take one more question over there in the back.
So, I think I did this in one of the games, but make something like a zombie baby. Is that considered a monster, or are there specific adjectives that override?
The question is, are zombie babies monsters?
Okay, so I didn't get into this, but with adjectives, now you're going to be stuck here for a little while, sorry. So objects were put in categories. Adjectives kind of were put in categories, but the categories didn't really matter. What actually happened with adjectives, especially when it came to AI-based stuff, is that, a baby had a set of things that it cared about, right? Like, it will go and pick up a pacifier before it eats lettuce, right? Maybe it eats lettuce, I don't know. So it had a sort of list of things that it does, and it will flee a monster before it eats baby food, right? There's this sort of priority system so that it would do the most reasonable thing in any given moment. What something like an adjective like zombie does is what we say is, okay, if you wrote zombie baby, the zombie part is more important than the baby part, because you want the baby to act like a zombie. You don't want a baby to look like a zombie but just act like a baby, right? So we had a bunch of things that were AI principles about zombies, which is they go, they bite things, those turn into zombies as well. And that they're kind of dead, right? And they look dead, right? We would put those all at the top. So before a baby flees from a monster, before a baby eats baby food, if it's a zombie baby, it's going to go bite people. So that's how we handled adjectives. We said the adjective is more important than the stuff with the object. So if you had a carnivorous vegetarian, it will eat steak. We are not going to say, well, it's a little bit weird to put those two together. We did have a concept of antonyms, so if you had a vegetarian carnivorous baby, only one of those would win, because it was a little bit too hard to try to simulate two things that were complete opposites at the same time. So that's kind of how we handle the zombie baby thing.
All right, let's give another round of applause to Liz England. Thank you so much.